Hey everyone, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to do this quick video for you about MLA citing. I know there were some questions in class, so this is especially if MLA citing or citations in general are a little bit new to you and you're just trying to understand some of the basics of how and why we might use this when writing a paper, doing the HI, or doing that Charlemagne outline. This could be useful for just understanding some of that purpose, okay? So a few things. First of all, let me see. Okay, the MLA is a style of citations, and there are a few different styles out there. So it tends to be discipline specific. So for history, we tend to use MLA. For psychology, they might use a different type of citations. APA is another really common example. For our purposes, we're interested in two things related to the citations. One would be, at the very, very end of an essay or the HI or your Charlemagne outline, you might include a list of works cited. That tells your reader, these are the sources that I consulted and also cited in my work. And if you're looking and reading the work, various citations that pop up, more information about those authors and where their work can be found would be included in the MLA citation. So, just like you may be used to putting or including a bibliography or a works cited list at the end, there is a specific format for citing your sources in MLA style, and that's what's on the screen here. A bibliography is a little different than a works cited list. Basically, a bibliography is where you have sources that you've consulted. A works cited list is specifically only those sources that you've actually cited by name in your essay or HI or outline or whichever. Okay, so this is kind of a listing that is specific to the things that you cited. Most cases, MLA citations that would be included at the end of your essay in a works cited list include the following pieces of information, and they're kind of in order by significance. Sometimes you don't have some of the pieces of information, in which case you wouldn't include them, but if you do, this is generally the information we're interested in, and then we'll kind of talk about how you might put some of this together. For MLA, the most important thing is the author or the creator of the source. This might be somebody who's an individual, might also be a museum, like the Holocaust Museum. It might also be an archive or a group like, the US Congress or something like that. You have the title of a source, okay? So the title of the source would be specific to whether it was on a website or it was found in a book or whichever you might have, or it was a book itself, the title of the source that you're actually using. The title of the container, and there may be more than one of these, containers are where you found the source. So you might be looking at an essay that was in a volume of works, some type of anthology, where there are many, many, many works. The container would be the anthology. The title of the source might be, whatever, Dante's Inferno or something like that. Other contributors might also be something that we're interested in. That might be something that would be important to note. The version, the number, those are significant sometimes if you're looking at periodicals, and you might have the periodicals might come out in date order, for example, or have numbers. There's also a publisher and a publication date and the location of where it was published. All of that information would also be included, and sometimes we're looking at the publication of the container rather than the actual author's work, okay, if the material that you're citing is found in a container. Some examples, just to give you an idea, and what's challenging is even though MLA uses a lot of consistent information, we're always kind of trying to put together some similar information, each type of source might have some differences. So one of the best sources that we'll use in class is known as the Purdue Owl. It's a useful guide for MLA, and every single type of source that you might want to cite, there's an example of at the Purdue Owl. So it might be a TV show that you're citing. It might be a YouTube video. It might be something that you found on a website, museum website, whatever it is, there's going to be a particular type of format. Here's a few just to give you an idea. The first one is a book. So imagine that you're, went to the library and you got a book. The name of the book is called The Hummingbird House. The author goes first, last name first, Henley Patricia. The title of the book is in italics. McMurray is the publisher, and then there's a date. Okay, so for the book, you really have very little information. That's really kind of the key pieces of information. If you have a website, right, we see in the second example, Lundman Susan. She's the author of the article that you're citing. The article has a title, and in this case, it's in quotes, How to Make Vegetarian Chili. Okay, that's what Susan Lundman wrote. But it's found in a website known as eHow, and the specific URL is going to be attached also. So the URL is www.eHow, and the very, very specific place where Make Vegetarian Chili might be found, okay? Sometimes you'll also see at the end of a citation of a website the date that that you access the source. So say that you found this last night, you might have, 10/22, 22 or whatever it is. A periodical, this would be like a magazine, like Time Magazine, might be something that is printed frequently like the New York Times. In this case, you have an author. Okay, sometimes you don't, but you might have an author. And in this case, last name first. You also have in quotes the title. So if it was a New York Times article, this would be the title of the article. And then it would, in italics, there would be a description of where the name of the periodical. So whether it was the New York Times, Time Magazine, in this case, Tulsa Studies in Women's Literature. And because it is a periodical, we have volume 15, number 1, and a date and specific page numbers. If you're using a source that does have page numbers, websites often don't, but periodicals and books do. If I was using all of that first source by Patricia Henley, I might not include page numbers. If I was only using one chapter of the book, I would then include page numbers. Okay, it tips off your reader to understand, kind of which section of the book. There might be one chapter that you use. We also are working with what's called Intext citations. This gives you a sense that in an essay, in the HI, or in the outline that you're doing for the Charlemagne assignment, you might include in the text, when you go to use evidence from the text that you're, kind of consulting, you might include an actual in-text citation. There's usually 2 pieces of information that are important. Don't worry if you didn't include page numbers for the Charlemagne outline. We didn't really talk about this and wasn't intended for you to do that. But usually what we're interested in is the author's name. And this author would correlate with the author that's listed in your works cited page. You also would oftentimes include a specific page number if you were using a book or you were using a periodical and you're quoting something and it is on a specific page. You're trying to give your reader as much specific information as possible so that they could also find the source information. So if they wanted to check on, what you put as your information, they could find it easily, and you're giving them information about how to do that. Okay, so here's a couple of different ways that you could include in-text citation information. And people, as you're doing this, like I was looking at the Afghanistan position papers, you're doing this in a variety of ways already. So here's just some examples. Say that you're consulting a book of poetry and it's by, William Wordsworth, okay? And you're going to be writing an essay, and you can do a kind of reference to Wordsworth in a couple of different ways. You could write a sentence that says, Wordsworth stated that romantic poetry was marked by a, quote, spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, quote, unquote. We get an idea of exactly what's coming from Wordsworth because it's in quotes. And by putting the page number in parentheses at the end, I know that if I go to my works cited page and I look up my Wordsworth source, I can go to page 263 of that source and find that particular quote. Because I've already mentioned Wordsworth in the sentence, according to Wordsworth, or Wordsworth stated, or one author named Wordsworth suggested that, anything like that, all I have to do is put the page number, because you've already told your reader who the author is. You don't have to repeat it at the end. Another example, romantic poetry is characterized by the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. In this second sentence, there is no mention of Wordsworth in the sentence, right? But we've still used a quote. We need to credit the author. You can't have a quote just sitting there without any credit. So Wordsworth 263. Notice that the period in this sentence comes all the way at the end of the parentheticals. It's almost like included in the sentence. One other way that you could do this is you could completely paraphrase and forget the quotes altogether. Wordsworth extensively explored the role of emotion in the creative process. In this case, you're not verbatim quoting the source, but you are including credit to Wordsworth, and you're noting 263. At the very end of this slide, you can see what you might see in the works cited list. At the end of your work, Wordsworth, William, lyrical ballads, Oxford, etc. That's information that you don't have to include in your parentheticals in the text. It's way too much information, but it does tell your reader this is by Wordsworth. So when you look at the works cited page, look for Wordsworth and you'll find all the details about the source, okay? Two other things we'll just look at that get to be a little bit confusing, and this is very common when you're the researcher, especially a student researcher. Oftentimes our sources are found in other sources. You may not be using a book by an historian, but you might find a quote by an historian in a New York Times article. And now, what do? Are you citing the historian? Are you citing the New York Times article? Basically, you're citing both. You're citing the source, the way in which you want to use it, but you're also citing where you got that, okay? And, containers, this would be, these examples are like if a whole source was found in another container. So let's look at the first one as an example. Jamaica Kincaid is the author. So we have this source, and I, as the researcher, might be very interested in this work by Jamaica Kincaid called Girl, okay? And this is the source that I'm working with, that I'm interested in citing. What I have to tell my reader is that I found this source in a book of contemporary American short stories. So even if I haven't read the rest of this book, I'm not interested in any of the other short stories, which are likely by other authors. I'm interested in Jamaica Kincaid's piece called Girl. I'm citing that first, and when I do my Intext citations, I'm going to use Kincaid because that's the person who really wrote the work that I'm talking about. But I'm telling my reader here, I didn't get Girl, I didn't just buy or just access that. I got it in a work that includes a lot of other short stories, and it's edited by Tobias Wolff, and it's published by Vintage in 1994, and it's on these page numbers, okay? So the container is also really important. The last example is one we could look at. DeWanda Wise wrote a piece called Why TV Shows Make Me Feel Less Alone. That is the actual source. So just like the Charlemagne source, that was by Einhard, that might be the source that you're actually using, in your paper, but then you're telling the reader, where did I get this source, right? I got it from someplace else, and it is in this website put together by this organization, NAMI. It is dated this date, and this is the URL, which I can see from the URL that this is a blog on this particular website by DeWanda Wise, and it is also, called How TV Shows Make Me Feel Less Alone, okay? The very last thing, and I'll note this kind of briefly, sometimes you cannot find the original source. And this is like the reference I said before, like you actually find maybe an historian who wrote a book about Charlemagne, but the historian is not, you're not reading the book, you're actually seeing it quoted in, okay, the New York Times. So you're getting the source indirectly. Ideally, you don't want to find most of your sources indirectly. You want to find the original source for the purpose of research, but sometimes it's just impossible and you're using an indirect source. If that's the case, you might note, blah, 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 as noted by Michael Wolff, but quoted in Fleischmann 64. The parentheses at the end there is really telling you, when I go to look at my works cited page, I'm going to see this listed as Fleischmann. So I'm crediting the author of the quote, but I am going to tell my reader, if you want to find where I got the quote, you really can't look in Michael Wolff because I didn't look in that work. I found it in Fleischmann, or I found it in the New York Times, or I found it someplace else. And this is where you can also find that, okay? And you might see this in the works cited list as Fleischmann, et cetera, George Eliot's Intellectual Life. But for my purposes, I'm interested in what Michael Wolff said, and Michael Wolff's expertise is what I'm interested in if I was going to be doing an OPVL on this later on, okay? I hope that helps. One thing I will recommend, and I'll put a link to it, when you start to get involved in MLA, you're going to be consulting some resources to try to find out, how do I do this type of source and this type of source and this type of source, because it's not always the same. Different types of sources are going to be including different information in the citations, and you'll often want an example. The Purdue Owl is probably the best place to find